So hi everyone, my name is Ray Eaton. I am a chemist with the Washington State Department of Ecology, and today I just wanted to briefly share some work the department has been doing on identifying safer alternatives to PFAS in paper-based food packaging. So sort of the inciting incident, I guess, for this work is that in 2018, the state of Washington passed a law that would prohibit the sale or distribution of paper-based food packaging to which PFAS have been intentionally added in any amount in the state of Washington. However, this law includes a requirement that before any restrictions can take effect, the Department of Ecology needs to conduct an alternatives assessment that looks at specific types of paper-based food packaging and identifies alternatives to PFAS in those types of food packaging that are safer, perform as well as PFAS, and are readily available and cost comparable. Once Ecology finds those safer alternatives and submits a report, then the prohibition on PFAS in food packaging takes place 2 years following that submission. So since everyone has done such a great job of introducing PFAS, I'm pretty much going to gloss over that. And instead, what I really wanted to focus on today was alternatives assessments and the process that we went through to identify those safer alternatives. So alternatives assessments are a process for identifying and comparing safer alternatives to chemicals of concern on the basis of their hazards, performance, and economic viability. These assessments prioritize reducing the risks associated with hazardous chemicals by identifying less hazardous alternatives for those chemicals. They also consider the performance, cost, and availability of these alternatives to ensure that any safer alternatives that are identified are also practical substitutes that can be adopted by businesses. So in the Department of Ecology, we use alternatives assessment processes and encourage the adoption of safer alternatives, mostly to focus on reducing sources of potentially hazardous waste like PFAS before cleanup is required. So for this alternatives assessment, we were specifically asked by the statute to use the Interstate Chemicals Clearinghouse's alternatives assessment guide to develop our assessment process. And this really consists of a 3-step assessment. The first step is determining the scope, so what you'll actually look at in the assessment. The second is gathering information about the alternatives and the chemical of concern. And the third is comparing the alternatives against the chemical of concern. So to start with, we first identified the types of food packaging that we would review in the alternatives assessment, and then identified substances or materials that could provide the same function as PFAS in those types of food packaging. Next, we collected information on the alternatives we identified and PFAS. We focused on using 4 assessment modules from the IC2 guide, which covered the statutory requirements that we assess alternatives for their potential chemical hazards, their technical performance, their cost, availability, and exposure potential. Finally, we took the data that we gathered from those 4 assessment modules and used them to compare each alternative to PFAS. If an alternative is found to be equivalent or preferable to PFAS in all 4 assessment modules, then we identify it as an alternative that meets all of our criteria. If it is less preferable than PFAS in one or more assessment module, then it would not be considered an alternative that meets all the criteria at this time. Finally, if we can't evaluate an alternative, typically because we lack enough information to assess it in one or more module, then we would find that there's insufficient data to reach a conclusion. And just as a reminder, in order for prohibition to go into effect, we need to identify at least one alternative that meets all of these criteria. So and I will add really quickly before we go on, sort of underneath all of this assessment process in our work is a really robust stakeholder engagement process. So we work with chemical and food packaging manufacturers, NGOs, product users, and really try to get their input on both the methods and the information that we use throughout this alternatives assessment process to try and again, make sure we're picking alternatives that can really be adopted by businesses in the state. So for this first alternatives assessment, we picked 10 types of food packaging that we would look at, and these can largely be grouped into 3 categories. The first is food contact paper, which consists of things like wraps and liners. The second is dinnerware, which would be products like plates or bowls. And the final category is takeout containers, which consists of things like pizza boxes and clamshells. Once we had identified the types of food packaging that we would look at, we then needed to identify what substances could replace PFAS in those food packaging types. And we've identified 10 alternative substances, which I'm listing here, but these can really be thought of as falling within 3 types of alternative. The first would be an alternative method for making paper so that it doesn't require PFAS in order to work. The second would be an alternative chemical additive or coating. So you could think of a wax coated paper or a plastic coated paper in place of PFAS. And the final is an alternative base material. So for example, just using bioplastic in place of paper entirely. I'll add that for the 10 alternative substances, the same alternative substance can be used across multiple types of food packaging, and not all 10 alternative substances will work for all 10 types of food packaging, just to make it extra complicated. So once we had identified the scope of our work, we next needed to collect information about the alternatives in PFAS and then compare them in the 4 assessment modules I identified earlier. And really what this boils down to is that for each assessment module, we're either evaluating the alternative substance that's being used to replace PFAS or products that are made that have one of the types of food packaging we're looking at and use one of the alternative substances we chose. And we compare them basically to answer a question for each assessment module. So in the case of the hazard assessment, we're looking to identify if any of the alternative substances are less hazardous than PFAS. In addition to answering these questions, to find that the alternative is preferable or equally preferable to PFAS in each assessment module, they need to meet certain criteria. So if we focus on the hazard and exposure assessments first, we're looking at comparing alternative substances to PFAS. And here, for an alternative substance to meet our criteria for hazard and exposure, one, we need to identify that the alternative substance is less hazardous than PFAS, and I'll talk more about how we do that in a moment. And also that the alternative substance has a similar or lower exposure potential than PFAS, or is identified as a substance of very low hazard concern using the hazard assessment, in which case additional information from exposure wouldn't actually help us or wouldn't change our finding about whether or not it was a safer alternative. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper into how we actually do comparative hazard between PFAS and the alternatives, just because, again, the core of the alternatives assessment is really to identify and promote safer alternatives to chemicals of concern. So for the hazard assessment, we really relied on a tool called the Green Screen for Safer Chemicals Hazard Assessment Tool. This is a tool that builds on existing frameworks for comparing chemical hazards, such as the globally harmonized standard for the classification of chemicals and the EPA's Safer Choice hazard criteria. In green screen assessments, data from peer-reviewed science, authoritative bodies, and regulatory studies are used to assess toxicity, and a certified green screen assessor will compile that collected data and use it to assign a score for each of 18 human and environmental health hazard endpoints. And this example table shows the scores that you can see for each of those 18 human health and environmental health hazard endpoints, and then also lists what they are below the table. The scores for each of those individual hazard endpoints are then used to assign an overall benchmark score for a chemical, which can range from 1 to 4. A benchmark 1 chemical is a chemical of high concern, whereas a benchmark 4 is a preferred or safer chemical. There's also an option to assign a benchmark unknown if there's inadequate data to characterize the chemical under the benchmark criteria. So what we could do is we could collect these chemical hazard assessments for PFAS and alternative substances that we were considering and compare them and identify any alternative substances that had lower benchmark scores and also didn't have the endpoints of concern that are typically associated with PFAS. Once we had identified alternative substances that appear to be safer, we next needed to look at whether alternative products that use those substances meet our requirements for technical performance and economic viability. So to assess the performance, we focused on looking at alternative products that used known substances in place of PFAS and asked if they could perform the same function as PFAS. And the two ways that we demonstrated that was one, the alternative product needed to be used in the market in the US. So people were buying it and using it. Additionally, we also needed to identify technical or promotional information that verified that those products provided the same functions as PFAS, namely oil and grease resistance and leak resistance in those products. Next, for cost and availability, we looked at whether the alternatives were offered for sale from multiple sources, which indicated that any consumers that were interested in using the packaging would likely be able to purchase it. And then we also looked at, whenever possible, what the price of those alternative products were so that we could compare them to PFAS and determine that products were cost comparable. So as I mentioned, we collected the information for those 4 assessment modules, and then we looked to see, are there any alternative products and alternative substances that meet the 5 criteria I've highlighted over the last 3 slides. If we identified an alternative product made with one of the alternative substances that met all 5 criteria, then it would be an alternative that we would term meeting our criteria for safer, but really it just means that it's safer and it meets the technical and economic performance standards that we've set for it. So we go back to the 10 types of food packaging that we looked at in this first alternatives assessment, and we looked and saw, were there any alternative substances we identified that met all of our criteria. In 4 of the 10 food packaging types, we did identify at least one alternative that met all of our criteria. And the column on the right lists what those alternatives were. So for example, for wraps and liners, we identified wax-coated paper as an alternative that met all of our criteria that could be used in place of PFAS. For the remaining,
Ray.
Thank you. For the remaining 6 alternative for the remaining 6 types of food packaging, we did not identify any alternatives that met our criteria at this time. But there are 2 important things to note here. The first is that, as you can see, we really just identified that there wasn't enough information to fully assess all of the alternatives for each type of food packaging. And really what that means is that these alternatives assessments relied on having access to proprietary information from chemical manufacturers and food packaging manufacturers, and we weren't always able to get access to that information in time to include it in this assessment. Furthermore, for a number of the alternative products we looked at, we did identify some limitations in terms of their availability in the market or their cost. However, there's been a lot of recent regulatory action around PFAS in food packaging, as well as increasing consumer demand for these products that we expect is going to change the market for PFAS-free products, and it's already starting to. So with all that in mind, we submitted this report to our legislature in February of 2021, which means that starting in February 2023, there will be a prohibition on intentionally added PFAS in wraps and liners, plates, food boats, and pizza boxes that are sold or distributed in Washington State. At the same time, we've already begun work on a second alternatives assessment to revisit those 6 types of food packaging where we weren't able to find alternatives that met all of our criteria, to see if the market has changed enough or if we can get access to new information so that we can identify alternatives that meet all of our criteria. And with that in mind, I'll just add very quickly, I've put up the project website link here if anyone is curious to read the entire document. This was a very brief overview of a rather long document. Or if you're interested in getting involved with our second alternatives assessment, you can find information at the site, or you can just contact me directly. And with that, if there's time, I'd be happy to answer any questions, and thank you for your attention.
Great, thank you, Ray. We do have time for a question or two. Janice?
Sure. How much of the used food packaging contains PFAS?
Yeah, that is an interesting question to answer. So for all of the types of food packaging that we looked at, we have evidence that PFAS is used in those types of food packaging. It depends a little bit on how the food packaging is made. So as I believe Simona mentioned in her talk at the beginning of the session, there are a number of products that are marketed as compostable or biodegradable products, particularly molded fiber products, if you know what those look like, that until very recently, most of them used PFAS to provide oil and grease resistance. For the other products, it can vary. And if people are curious, there's a few studies I can point you to if you contact me directly. But PFAS are still being used in this market. And so, we're definitely addressing we're definitely trying to address sort of that source of PFAS, but it'll depend on the product and how it's manufactured. And yeah, it gets a little tricky very quickly.
I think we can take one more. Thanks, Ray.
Yeah, we had a question about bioplastics as a substitute and any problems that you might see there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so bioplastics, one of the reasons we focused on them as an alternative is because they are marketed as compostable. The ones we focused on are marketed as compostable in commercial facilities. And so there is, of course, evidence they break down faster. But I do know that one of the things we've gotten some feedback on that people are interested in is how they might contribute to microplastics, and also overall concerns associated with the toxicity of additives in plastic. So our hazard assessment will look into things like toxicity from chemicals within the plastic. It can look at that. But in terms of microplastics, that gets a little bit more into a life cycle assessment, which we didn't do in this first alternatives assessment.
Great, thank you. And we are out of time, but I do want to read, there's a comment here. It says, this might be a silly question, but do we even know if people care that the delivery item people get care if it looks greasy? The social science side of it. There's a local burger place here that dumps their fries in a brown paper bag, and I personally love getting the greasy bag. All that being said, I think the work you're doing is amazing and so important. So thank you.